All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS office hours. It is Thursday, October 27th of 2022. Got some NFL Showdown action going on tonight. Got a 4-game NBA slate. Not in the hockey streets, so don't know what's going on in hockey, but I'm sure there's some games tonight that mean something to our hockey community out there. So with that being said, we're going to jump right into it. For those of you who are new here, welcome. This is a show where we talk about how to use the SaberSim app, answer any and all DFS related questions. If you're not a member of our Discord, there's a link in the description below to get joined up. Highly recommend getting joined up. If you have any questions for me, get them in the YouTube chat now. If you're in the Discord, you can post them in the office hours channel in Discord. Got plenty of questions to talk about today. Looking forward to giving you guys a full stream with lots of awesome content. So with that being said, we're going to get the SaberSim app pulled up here, and then we're going to get going with a question that came in from support. I missed this one yesterday, and I felt pretty bad about it. So going to hit this question that came in from support, and then there was also another question that came in yesterday, right when we hopped off from Mike Ganistan. So, Mike, if you're here, we're going to get to your question as well. So, let me pull up the app here. Let me pull up the question. And the first question from support says, I was curious if you all have come up with any new metrics for customers to track the success of their DFS process with the new profitability research you all have done. The last time I heard this discussed in office hours, the metric to track was the percent of entries finishing in the top 5% of contest pools, with the goal for this metric to be more than 5%. If this metric still the primary success metric to track for short-term results, follow up, would this metric apply to the top 1% of entries in the same logic, more than 1% of entries finishing in top 1% of the contest pool? Okay, really good question here. And I think it's always worth touching on from time to time. So, the question is, how do I tell if I'm quote unquote like a good DFS player aside from financial value? Is there a way to track my progress, day to day, week to week, month to month, and kind of determine if I'm on the right path or if I am on the wrong path? And I think it's a good question. So, what we're talking about here is tracking your number of entries in the top X% of a contest. So the term we like to use is top 1% equity. I would highly recommend not tracking the top 5%. I think 5% is just like a little low. And frankly, I think sometimes top 1% is a little low depending on the type of contest you're playing. So, okay, starting from ground zero, if you enter a 100-person tournament, single entry, night after night, the odds that you get, if all players are the same strength and there's no rake, right? The average player would finish in first 1% of the time, second 1% of the time, and it would just be like a math equation, right? But if all players are the same skill, which we know in DFS players are not of the same skill level. So, a better metric is like, okay, if you're a player and you're finishing in the top 1% of contests 1.5% of the time, that means that you're that much further ahead than the average player. And so what that is essentially doing is saying that, the more you finish in the top 1%, the more often you have that ability to get those exponential payouts and essentially win more money in the long term. I think that even sometimes top 1% might not be enough if you're playing these like huge large field contests, like on a NFL Sunday. If you're playing like, I think the $3.20 max is like almost 400,000 entrants. I know the Millie is a couple 100,000 entrants. So if you're playing like these really large field, hundreds of thousands of entries, then you might need to be looking at something closer to the top 0.1% of an entry. Because if you have a 400,000 entry contest, top 1% is only 4,000. So, 0.1 is top 400. Like, you still need to get, top, I don't know. I mean, top 10 is great. Top 10 is like really, really good. So, what is okay? If you get the top 40, that's 0.01%. You need to come in the top 0.01% of the contest to be in 40th. And, you're still not winning the contest in 40th. So I would approach it from looking at your contests in different buckets. I think a good way to do it is like you could take all of your diversifiers and look at those and kind of determine your top 0.1% equity in those is probably a better metric to look at. And you can then look at your elevators if you're following the DFS profit plan, where you're breaking up your 20 max and 150s into diversifiers and your single entry and 3 max into elevators, and then look at your elevator contests in a different bucket. I think top 1% for elevators is completely fine. Oftentimes the contests in that range are, range from like hundreds to thousands to maybe tens of thousands at like the highest levels. Like if you're playing like, I think like the $5 single entry on a NFL Sunday is like 35,000 entries. So, 1% is like top 350. It's probably not the best metric on like some of those really large stuff. But I would say, take like your single entries in 3 max, oftentimes are going to be hundreds to a couple thousand entries, and looking at top 1% equity there, looking at top 0.1% equity in the larger field stuff is metrics that I think are worthy of being tracked. And the best tool on the market right now to do that, if you can afford it, is Roto Tracker. It is a paid subscription. So, if it's not like in the bankroll, don't use it. But if you really want to dive in to these metrics, you can, I think you can use it use it free up to like 750 past contests. So you would have to like download your DraftKings CSV and then like delete so many files, so you are within the amount that is still in the free plan. But if it's in the bankroll to be like a paid subscription for you for the year, I think it's like really worth using. You could chop up your data all different ways. They have graphs for 0.1%, 1%, 5%. You could do like any by site, by contest size, by entry limit, all those types of things. So I think that's a really cool tool. Or you could build it yourself. I know when Jordan was on last week, somebody asked a similar question and they said that they were tracking it themselves in Excel. If you have the skill set to do that, I think that's another great way to do it. The thresholds that I gave are thresholds that I feel are worth being tracked and kind of make a little more sense. But so, I would stay away from like the 5%, and then I would lean more toward 1% in like the elevators, and then probably 0.1% in your diversifiers. So hope that helps. We'll get you a timestamp recording of this video. The support team will get that back over to you. And then we're going to roll into another question. This one came in Discord. I wanted to get to this one because it's not in the office hours channel. It's over in the NBA channel. And let me hover over to it really quickly here. So there was some talking points earlier in the day. I know that Ben commented on this, so I'm going to go ahead and start off with Ben's response to questions about our ownership projections, like overall. And I think Ben had a lot of great points here. I'll add in some of my own stuff. I know there was a follow-up to this question as well. So let me hit this question from Ben. People were asking about like ownership projections in general, ownership after lock. Ben took a minute, Ben from the SaberSim team, and took a minute to say there are a few things that can impact ownership. We take into account external factors, but our ownership process is closer to approximating an optimal field rather than the emotional reasons a player may go over/under ownership projections. Due to this and other factors, I think sometimes stars can be projected lower than they actually come in. Late swap can significantly impact ownership if a play opens up post-lock. Pre-lock ownership may not mean much if there are multiple late swap opportunities in a single night. Contest you play in, Billy is right. Our ownership is approximating 150 max large field. Generally, it will be more condensed in smaller entry / smaller field. Ownership can be tricky, and we are always working to improve it. It is an area you can add value if you have a feel for your specific contests or other factors that may steam ownership. And then there was a follow-up to that, which was the question for office hours. So LD responded saying, thank you, Ben. This feedback is helpful for understanding how SaberSim constructs its ownership projection. What may mitigate ownership concerns for any given user, however, is advice or guidance on how to fit the provided ownership projections into one's process when one has neither a natural nor analytical understanding of ownership levels unique to different contest demographics. Personally, I ignore the ownership factor despite it being a significant one insofar as desiring to be ahead of everyone else in a contest, because I don't yet have the knowledge to control it, yet I understand the frustration of observing larger than expected disparities on a daily basis between projected ownership and actual ownership. That is, what advice would you give a random SaberSim user about this? Perhaps this is something Andrew and / or Jordan could discuss during office hours. This is a concern that continues to arise for different users. If there have been a targeted discussion about this original, then could you all point me to a link about it? But anyways, we kind of covered the question right there. And the question is, what can any and all SaberSim users do if they think they see an ownership discrepancy? So I kind of want to give my own thoughts on the topic first before diving into it. So, let's take player point projections. So regardless what contest you play, the point projections are not going to change. Like Luka's not going to score more points in a smaller field contest that's a single entry than he scores in a large 150 max contest, because the points are constant. The ownership is dynamic in those contests. It varies based on the number of entries, the amount of entries each person has in the contest, and ultimately the players that are playing those contests. And I think that's what makes ownership so interesting from a game theory perspective, is that it can change contest to contest. And those are factors that are really hard to model. And frankly, you can have a group of players in one contest and with one skill level, and then a completely different group of players in a different contest with a different skill level, and they'll treat the players differently. So that's ultimately what makes ownership so hard to model. And our ownership model is an algorithm. And the good thing about it is that, when projections update, the ownership reruns, and ownership is constantly automatically updating, which makes it very fast and very usable. I think that part is great about it. Some of the negatives are that it doesn't pick up on narratives well. It doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care if your name is Luka Doncic or John Morant, but, players playing DFS contests do, right? And, the other thing that comes to mind for me is how many people are actually care about some of these metrics. Like, how many people care about a player's ownership? There's a vast majority of people who are hand building on their phone that don't care at all about a player's ownership, don't even know what it means. So, how easy is it to model a group of people that are irrational at best, and are building cash lineups and GPP lineups, are building based on players that they know by name? Like the algorithm can't pick up on those things, right? So I think those are opportunities. I'll say that anyone watching this stream knows more about DFS than the average person. So when you're looking at projections, you're building your models, you're in the SaberSim app, if ownership looks off to you, I think it's okay to trust your judgment and make an adjustment. You know more than you think you know, especially about something like the eye test, because what you're doing is you're looking at the projections, you're looking at the names, you're looking at the values, and you're giving it the eye test. And if you look at this and you say, Luka is the highest projected player by 10 points and his ownership looks low, you're probably right directionally. You don't have to be perfect. I think the more important thing is to say, I think Luka should be, 20, and then he comes in at 16. Like, you weren't wrong. You were directionally right. So as long as you make adjustments that you feel are in the correct direction, I think that's like totally okay. I think another one tonight is, Paul George is up here and he's questionable. And on a short slate with other good options, I think that people will probably shy away from his questionable tag. And he might come in a lot lower owned because not everyone in the field is late swapping and paying attention to news post lock. So, like, that's another great opportunity there. So, what I'll say is that, our ownership is based off of like the largest field, the largest prize pool, usually like the Millie Maker or like the flagship 150 max contest. If you're mostly playing like elevator type stuff, it's totally okay to make adjustments based where you see fit, especially like the higher point projected guys, the higher salary guys, the higher big name guys. I think there's a lot of that. So, our ownership isn't perfect. The team is always working behind the scenes. Like, I could tell you that we made some incremental improvements to ownership today because, the entire team is in the Discord. We see the conversations. It's not a set it and forget it type of thing. We really care about the information that we're putting out with the models, with the algorithms. And just know that, if there's any and all like discrepancies, we are looking at and trying to determine, if what we can do to make our projections better. So team is always working on it, always making incremental improvements. Ownership will never be perfect. I can tell you that. And it's always going to vary. And, ownership changes for a number of reasons. It's been a hot topic around the DFS industry. And, ownership is not going to pick up like the James Robinson situation from like 2 weeks ago on the NFL main slate. A lot of talk about James Robinson being a great play in different podcasts, and our model is not going to pick up on that. And if those are things you're listening to, you're keeping your ear to the ground, don't be afraid to make adjustments to ownership, especially. So those are my thoughts there. Let me know if anyone has any follow-up, but wanted to get to that one early. And now we are going to move over to questions that came in the office hours channel. Going to start with one that we missed right at the end of yesterday's show from Mike Ganistan. So Mike had a question here about rules. Question is, let me put this in here. Is there a way to set a rule that puts 2 plays from the highest projected game, if that makes sense? So yes, Mike, it totally makes sense. So looking at the slate tonight, it looks like Memphis and Sacramento are the highest total on the slate for sure. So what you would do, you come into lineup rules, you would add a new rule. What I would do is I would do a group rule, and I would say I would make it automatic, and then I would say use at least 2 group by game, and then you could add a stat requirement if you want, but if you don't want one, that's fine. If you want any players, or if you want to target like the higher salary players, higher projected players, you could put a stat requirement to say, my projection greater than whatever value like you determine. So what I would do is say use at least 2 group by game, and then I would actually remove the stat requirement. So what I would do is I would hit this save as a manual rule. Okay, when you do that, you could hit this drop down over here on the right of the rule, and then you can uncheck the teams you don't want. So if you only wanted it for the Sacramento Memphis, since that's the highest total, you just uncheck these other games, or you could just completely delete the other games, and then they will no longer be there. So that's what I would do to get at least 2 players from a high total game. And that's the best way to use the role. I think a stat requirement is also a good idea if you're looking to target specific players from the game. So let me know if you have any follow-up there. Mike, sorry we missed you right at the end of yesterday's stream, but we're going to move on to the next question here. from Astro Pepper. And the question says, if I make DK NBA lineups and add the unique filter, let's say I want to use 5 total lineups, but have at least 2 uniques per lineup. Later that night, I need to late swap. How do I ensure I can still keep 2 uniques per lineup after swapping? Okay, really good question here from Astro Pepper. The short of it is, when you late swap, there is currently not an option to have a min unique factor part of that. So what we're talking about is this min unique players. And what he is saying is, I'm going to set this to whatever number that I want pre-lock. In his example, the number was 5. And then, how do I maintain this in doing a late swap? So, when you do a late swap, you do it from the home screen, and then you come up here. This late swap is toggled on after Slate locks, and then it'll be toggled on, and then you can change your settings in this screen. So I don't know the problem is that handling it post build is what we used to handle it pre-build, and then we changed to handling it post-build, which we felt was a lot better. So now for late swap, we almost need to tell the builder pre-build again. So it's like a little bit of a nuance there, something that the team is still working through. I would say that since each lineup only gets built one time, you're much more likely to maintain your min uniques. The problem before, or the problem with the way it works now, is that, SaberSim builds all of your lineups and then grades it based on SaberScore. So what happens is, like, a lot of the same players or the same combinations are, the builder just thinks they're great plays. So it pushes those up in your pool of lineups. So toward the top of your pool, you have a lot of more similar combinations, which is what we're trying to combat by using this min unique players. When each lineup is getting rebuilt one time, SaberScore doesn't come into account as much because there's less to grade. So it's much more likely that your lineups maintain like a more unique inter-lineup correlation is not as strong. The inter-lineup correlation won't be as strong, and it's more likely that you maintain those min uniques. But it's a problem that we're trying to solve so you can account for it before doing a late swap. I wouldn't worry too much about it right now, but it is a feature that we want to kind of bring into late swap. It's just in like the regular build screen. We want to bring it into late swap. We're working on ways to do that. So stay tuned for more information there. I wouldn't worry too much about it. I think that the value you get from late swapping at all is much higher than the value you get from keeping your min uniques. Obviously, like, the golden answer would be to have both of those things together, which we're working on. So stay tuned there, but I would encourage you to continue to late swap. In the meantime, you're going to get much more value out of late swapping in general. So good question there. Going to move on to the next question. There was a question from Phantom kind of referencing the ownership topic. We already hit on that one, Phantom. So if you missed it, just rewind a little bit and you'll be able to catch up on that. Got a question here from AB Smooth, and AB Smooth said, do the ownership fade or correlation sliders have any impact on how SaberSim is building the 1500 lineups, or do they purely impact the SaberScore in step 3? Okay, good question, AB Smooth. So what happens when we build the lineups? We run all the sims, we pull the sim data, and then what happens? The ownership fade, what it does is it applies so I'm just going to read it first. So it incorporates the projected popularity of players into your lineup. A higher ownership fade favors less popular players, while a negative weight favors more popular players. So basically what's happening is that we randomly sample the sims, and then each player has a projection from the random sampling. If the ownership fade slider is off, we will just take that projection and use that for your lineups. The higher you put the ownership fade, what is happening is that we are looking at each position and each player, and we are adjusting their projection based on their ownership versus other players' ownership at their position, is basically what's happening. We're applying a metric of some sort that adjusts a player's projection based on their ownership compared to other players at their position, and then using that new projection to insert them to decide whether or not to insert them into your lineup. So, high ownership players get treated worsely the higher you put it, and then lower owned players get treated better. And then inversely, if this is off, then we don't care as much whether you are high owned or low owned. So that is what is happening when we're building your lineups. When we are grading your lineups is what SaberScore is doing. And then SaberScore uses the sliders as the sliders are basically so SaberScore changes dynamically based on where the sliders are. If correlation is turned off, SaberScore will not grade for correlation. If ownership fade is turned all the way to 10, then SaberScore will grade for ownership more highly than if ownership fade was turned off. So SaberScore grades the lineup based on the sliders, and then the sliders help to get the players into the lineup. So it's like a two-step process. Ownership matters at both steps depending on where the slider is at. So that's the best way to think about it. Been a lot of questions on, the relationship between SaberScore and ownership fade. I think, if you're still like unclear about it, keep asking the questions and I'll keep trying to describe it in different ways that can maybe make more sense. You just got to hear it a couple times, kind of like get the idea in your head. I know that some of these concepts aren't like the most easy to understand, so happy to keep talking about them for as long as people have questions about it. All right, gonna hit this next question here from John Stanger in Discord, and gonna get this one in here. So John said, couple of NBA late swap questions. One, should I use the same contest settings for late swap or should I make changes? Two, is the only way to deal with exposures in the home screen for late swap? Do I have to just keep rebuilding and tweaking the exposures in order to get it how I want? Or is there a better way to do that? Three, how does late swap work in terms of keeping up with the sliders versus just re-optimizing based on updated projections? Okay. Three really good questions, John. Going to hit them kind of one at a time here. First question, should I use the same contest settings for late swap or should I make changes? Okay, I think the easiest answer is that you should keep them the same. The only time I think it makes sense to change them is if a large number of games have played and there are only a few games left and you kind of know how you're doing in a contest. So I think we saw like a good example of that yesterday in yesterday's slate. We had by the time these last two games start, we had a lot of games very near the end or very far along. So like all of these 4 and 4:30 games Pacific time had basically ended. And then these like 5 p.m. games were in like the later half of the game, late third quarter, early fourth quarter, with only one game probably like in the second quarter / near halftime. So like for me, I was doing pretty well after like the first batch of games were kind of over / near the end. What I did was I was playing the large field and I had my sliders all the way up to 337. So what I decided to do was I brought them down a little bit, said, I'm doing pretty good. I don't need to get as correlated with the players that are still pending. I don't need to fade some of the top projected plays who have high ownership, and I don't need as much sim diversity. Give me, more of the best plays and don't take away from the fact that they're highly owned, because a lot of the other plays that I already played did well. So I don't need to fade the field as much. And I just wanted to kind of try and get more of the best plays into my lineup. I think that, if you're not sure how you're doing, if you're not sure how you're doing, or it's not clear whether you're going to have like a good night or a bad night, leave them where they are. These are still the optimal sliders for the contest, regardless of at what point in the night it is. These sliders have been back tested and set to this point for a reason. You should feel comfortable leaving them there throughout the entire night. But if you're doing really good, you can play around with the idea of dropping the sliders a little bit. If you're doing really, really badly, you can also, maybe bump your ownership fade a little bit, try to get to more plays that are less owned to try and help you to recoup some of the losses for that you're currently facing. So I think it's okay to leave them. I also think it's okay to change them depending on how you're doing in your contests. Second question here is the only way to deal with exposures in the home screen for late swap. The answer is yes. And there was an update posted yesterday by Matt from founder of SaberSim on just the way that we were handling late swap exposures. He posted an update about it yesterday in the NBA Discord channel saying that late swap should be much better at honoring exposures set in the home screen as of yesterday. I messed around with it myself yesterday and everything seemed to be being honored really well. The late swaps are a little slower, but that they're still very fast overall. And since it's only building the amount of lineups that you have, it doesn't make that much of an impact, the small time loss. So I would continue to set the exposures and feel more comfortable knowing that they are going to be honored in the home screen and continue to run your late swaps that way. Third question here, how does late swap work in terms of keeping up with the sliders or just re-optimizing based on updated projections? So, okay, the way late swap kind of works is that, player news happens, guys get rolled out, guys get rolled in, starting lineups come out. SaberSim runs the sims just like normal. And then, late swap is like really close to the way that your lineups are built pre-lock. The only difference is that SaberSim now inserts the players into your lineup and says, okay, these positions are filled and this much salary is used. Find the best lineup that from the sims that you pull that meets these requirements. And then the lineup will get the lineups that the players that get inserted are still being used from the sims to still have a range of outcomes. And then the lineups are filled in with those best remaining players from a bucket of sims. So think about it that way. SaberSim is not turning into a traditional optimizer in the late swap process, still using the sim outputs and still using updated projections throughout the night. So if you guys have any more questions about late swap, happy to continue to talk about it, but feel like I answered those three questions pretty well. Let me know if there's any update or any further discussion there. And I see a comment here from Pete in regard to John's question. Pete said, let's see what Pete said. Great question. I'd like to see an option for a quick late swap that functions how it does today, but then also have an option for a late swap that is similar to step 3, where it generates a pool and you can tweak more. So Pete, this is an awesome feature request. It's something that, we've talked about a lot. We call it like a late swap pool. We want to have, a late swap pool of lineups as opposed to just building the number of unique lineups that you have. It's something that is something we want to do. It's in our roadmap to build out. I can't say, that it's whether it's in progress today or not, but it's in the roadmap. It's a feature request that has been on the something that people have requested for a long time and something that we really want to build into the app. It's quite the technical problem, but hopefully we can build that for everybody down the road. So I'll make a note and put it as another tick on the feature request list and let the team know that people are still asking for it there. So gonna keep going here. Got a question from Slow-Mo 3210 and still working through the Discord questions. We will be jumping over to YouTube chat very shortly, everybody. So question says, if going by the profit plan and needing to enter about $5 on tonight's NFL Showdown slate, would it be better to enter $2 into the large dime package plus one single entry plus 1 3-max, or just put all $5 in the quarter jukebox? Okay, good question. I would go about it from the first approach that you posed, the $2 dime that's a 20 max, and then get some action in on the single entry and the 3-max contest. I think that the kind of the point of playing some single entries and 3 maxes and some 20 maxes and 150 maxes overall is that it's going to be a lot harder to basically realize the times where you do indeed win in those larger field contests. And overall, it's going to make your bankroll and just you're going to have bigger swings only playing those like really large field where you're only going to win your the amount of times you win is really really like far and apart. And yeah, you're going to get paid like a lot when you do, but you gotta make it to that point. So mixing in some of the single entries and 3 maxes that are smaller field that you have a better chance of winning is going to just smooth out your variance over time. So I wouldn't recommend playing too large field. I would recommend playing the one large field and then the one smaller field. I think it's a better approach and much closer to the DFS profit plan overall. So that's my answer there. Got another question here from John. John said, and this in the chat, can you see what each of your lineups were late swapped to? If not, it would be a really cool feature to see what swaps occurred in each lineup when reviewing your lineups. Okay, this is a really good question. I don't have any late swaps here at the moment that I can show you, but basically when you're in a build, and so let's say you run a late swap, and then this is my late swap build, you're going to have a drop down over here on the right. It's going to say lineups. Then you're going to have another one. Instead of pool, it's going to say changed. And then you're going to have another one that's going to say unchanged next to it. So if you had 20 lineups, it will show you how many changed and then how many were unchanged. So you're not going to be able to see what they were changed from, but you're going to be able to kind of keep track of, okay, how many lineups changed, how many didn't change. But I do see the value in what you're talking about. It was something that we kind of used to have where like you could hover over the lineup. I don't believe you can do that anymore, but I could be wrong there. So it's something I'll look at offline, John, and let you know if that is indeed something you can still do in the app. I don't think so at the moment, but it is a feature I could see us bringing back that people would like. So I'll make a feature request to add that if I don't end up seeing it in my review offline. So I'll make a note for you there to do that. So going to keep moving here. Got a question here from Nipsey. Nipsey said, and I think this is in relation to our earlier discussion, aren't ownership decisions strictly based on game theory? So the way we calculate ownership, yes, our ownerships are algorithm based. It is basically trying to determine the optimal rate for each and every player in the pool. Doesn't care about narratives, doesn't care about who you are, how much your salary is, are you a household name or not? And those are things that can cause ownership to be swayed one direction or another. So those are like challenges. Guys get talked up on podcasts, guys get talked up on shows. And, also another thing is like, I see another comment here from Michael Bergerson. It says, is Luka ownership right on FanDuel at 11%? So, let's just say across the industry, Luka was projected at 11%. Maybe like everyone thinks that's low, and then they start jamming Luka into their lineups. So, ownership projections themselves can sway ownership. If a player is low owned across the industry, a lot of people are probably going to start playing them. And then if a play looks bad and they're highly owned, maybe less people play them. So it's like ownership projections themselves are possibly an input into what an actual player's ownership ends up coming in at. So it's just, it is really, really interesting when you think about it from a game theory perspective. I'll tell you that, Michael, if you don't think Luka's ownership looks right, this kind of gets back to what we were talking about earlier, is that everyone watching this show knows more about, like has like an eye test. And I think like if it doesn't look right, I would say trust your intuition, bump it up. I think it's okay to, as long as like, if you make an adjustment, even if it's not perfect, if it's directionally right, that gets you closer to what you were looking for in the first place. So I'm going to keep moving here. Got a question from Reese's Pieces in the Discord. So our last Discord question, and then we'll be jumping over to YouTube chat. Question reads, how do we see that NBA players have a high upside? Okay, really good question. So what I would do a couple things. So always remember that, our player projections are from our simulation database, and you can click on any player and you can see their range of outcomes here. Okay. So that's one note. Our players are not normally distributed. In basketball, they are closer to a normal distribution, but the sim data helps us a lot in determining players' upside is basically my point there. We have these percentiles over here to the right of the projection. So this 58.6 is Giannis's mean projection in the sims. These values show what he scores in his 50th percentile games, in his 95th percentile games, which happen, 1 out of 20 times. And so you can kind of use these to see what a player's upside is at at their best games, and at like some of their worst games, what point totals are they putting up. So I think these percentiles are like a really good metric to look at and to kind of be aware of when comparing players. So, I think that looking at percentiles is something that I like to do a lot. I kind of walked through my NBA process a couple weeks ago before the season and said that, I like to look at players' percentiles compared position by position and kind of see who sticks out to me. That's something I like to work into my process. So I think that, you could see kind of upside in the percentiles. If you're looking for something more like optimal rates, I would run, something closer to like a 0-0-10 build where you're taking single sim optimals, disregarding correlation, disregarding ownership fade, see how often they're coming up and compare that to their ownership. And then that'll give you something closer to their like quote unquote optimal rate in the sims. So those are my thoughts there. Going to be, looks like we got a follow up here from Nipsey. Going to get this in the chat here. So Nipsey said, how much tweaking to the ownership projections are done before the slate to account for a player being steamed? So Nipsey, that's kind of what we're talking about. Our ownership is an algorithm, and we do not go into, we can't go into the algorithm and put steam on players. That's where I think is a value add for users who see steam, who are looking on, are aware of other competitor sites and what they're putting out, are on Twitter, seeing what the narratives are for the week, listening to other podcasts. And, this is something that I think Max Steinberg, when Max comes on, he talks a lot about, saying that, we want our users to be out in the DFS world, doing other research, listening to other shows and podcasts, trying to get a sense of where ownership might be going, because ownership is very fluid. So I think if you are doing those things, I think that gives you even more reason to make adjustments where you see fit. And I would say, out of all the things to make adjustments to, I think making ownership adjustments is the least harm you can do to any of the sim inputs. So those are my thoughts there on ownership. All right, hopping over to YouTube chat. Got plenty of questions still to get to today. Got a question from Graveyard Secret Society. Said, what is an optimal min unique setting for a small 4-game slate for GPPs? Okay, good question. What I will say is that I don't think that there's ever going to be an optimal min unique setting for any size slate. And I also think it depends on the number of lineups that you're building for. I think, min uniques for 20 lineups is a lot different than min uniques for one lineup. And I think one way we can see this, is how far we have to go into the pool when you're building 20 lineups versus one lineup. So let's give this a shot. Let's scroll down to our bottom lineup here. And you can see that it's 20. We're going to increase this, let's say, to 4. And at 4 min uniques, we're at lineup 166. Okay. We're going to increase this to 5. 5, we're at 409. So 5, we're kind of pushing it. I bet you we can't get to 6. So at 6, they're saying there's only 7 lineups in our pool of 500 that have that many players different. So 5 is the most we can go here. Got to go pretty low in the pool to get to 5. We're at lineup 401, 409, 368. At 4, we're only at lineup 166. So staying in the top half of that pool, I would be more comfortable using 4 in this scenario than using 5. But then, let's say we're only building like for a 3 max, right? At 4, we're barely at lineup 13. Like, that's awesome. We're for sure going to be able to get to 5. We're going to be able to get to 6. And, we're the value that we were at with 4 at 166, our 166th ranked lineup, we're only at our ranked 147th lineup with min uniques at 6 compared to 4. So the min uniques is going to depend on the number of lineups that you're building for and also how many lineups are in your pool. There's not a wrong or right answer. If you want to be more concentrated, then you would use less min uniques. And if you want to be more spread out, you would use more min uniques. So it's really like a personal preference and kind of what kind of player you are. Are you more aggressive? Are you a little more risk averse? And, your approach to any given slate. So that's how I would think about it from those different angles and kind of answer some of those questions for yourself and determine what is the best min unique setting for you and your process, specifically for the number of lineups that you're playing. Take all of those things into account and then set the min unique filter. All right. Going to jump into this next question from Michael. Michael said, how do I find good plays for NBA? Like, I don't know. So Michael, what I could say is that, SaberSim is going to, the best thing for you to do is to come into this build screen, set the style, set the entry limit, set the entrance for the contest you're playing. SaberSim is going to update our sliders based on the type of contest that you're playing. These sliders are back tested to these values through our extensive back testing that we do to give you the best outputs for your contests here. I would say, the sliders are really good and the outputs that they give are also really good. So what you should do, what I like to do, the approach I like to take is that I don't like to make too many inputs into the sims. I like to trust the sim itself. And what I like to do is handle my, I like to come into step 3 and approach it from a risk management perspective. And, let's say we're playing like a 3 max, just like this. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. We have 5 players that are in every single lineup. Do I want to have that many of the same pieces in every single lineup? I think, since SaberSim doesn't understand risk, it's going to give you the best plays and it's going to give you them at a very high rate. And it's saying, hey, the most positive ROI thing you can do is play as much of these 5 guys as you can fit into your lineups. And it's up to you to come in here and say, do I want my lineups to be this risky, or do I want to take an approach that is a little more risk averse and be a little more spread out? So I don't think the issue isn't with getting to the best plays. SaberSim is going to give you the best plays for your contests at the rate that it deems that they are good plays. I think it's more important for you to come in here and say, hey, am I okay accepting this much risk in a given set of lineups? And, come at it from that approach, not trying to find the best plays. SaberSim is going to do the hard work for you, determine all of the combinatorial factors with positional eligibility, with salary, with number of games on the slate, and come up with the best, weigh all of those factors together, correlation, ownership, etc., and give you the best plays. You really need to come in here and kind of, tune SaberSim down or tune it up based on the style of play that you have. So that's my best advice there. Graveyard Secret Society had another question, said, what are some other ways to generate unique lineups with a low chance of being duplicated other than reducing max salary, Xing out players, or using a high min unique setting? Okay, Graveyard, I'm going to assume this question is for Showdown specifically. If it's not for Showdown, let me know. That way I don't go in the wrong direction answering the question. But because you're talking about, duplication and reducing max salary, I'm going to assume that it is indeed for Showdown. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hover over to NFL and we're going to talk about the Showdown for tonight. And okay, so you said not for Showdown. So Graveyard, I think that, if it's not for Showdown or if it's not for MMA, I think that you don't have to worry about duplication as much. So, the question says, for large field GPPs with 200K people, I think that, what you're talking about are mostly like your classic slates, your big slates, you know, your rate of duplication in those large field, in those classic slates is generally very, very low. So I don't think you need to worry so much about duplication. And especially, if we're talking about this question for NBA, in NBA, what you'll see is like if we go back to NBA and we go back to a slate like yesterday. So let's go back to yesterday's slate. Okay, we got a big 10-game NBA slate. Your min salary is going to be 49.5. So, we're saying that, you shouldn't use a salary below 49.5. Technically, like we're basically saying like, you don't need to do this. Like you don't need to go lower than this value. And I wouldn't lower it. I don't think that's a good idea. I think, basketball is a fairly quote unquote predictable, projectable sport. And, there is a limit. Like you do want to use a lot of your salary, like for good reason. So, in a sport like NFL Showdown or a contest type for that matter, where duplication is important, it is an optimal strategy to not use the max salary. But in a sport like NBA, where there are, millions of lineups that you can build on any given night, you don't need to worry about duplication as much. And for that matter, you don't need to worry about using less salary to get unique. So I would highly recommend not taking that approach. And if you have any follow-up, so it looks like there's a little follow-up. So for smaller slates, sorry for not including more info in the original question. That's perfectly fine. I'm glad you're still hanging around and we can get this detail to give you better answers. So it says, for smaller slates, specifically probably talking about a slate like today. And, will there be some duplication on slates like tonight? Yes, but you're not going to see those, 100-way, 200-way chops for the top lineup. There might be like a under 5 dupes at most. I think, much more likely that you don't dupe, or if you do dupe, you dupe with like 1 to 3 lineups. I don't think that you should be bringing min salary down that much to account for it. So, if you could see here on a smaller slate like today, SaberSim does lower the min salary right off the bat from 49.5 to 49,000. I wouldn't make it any lower than that. The concepts that you're talking about are already being taken into account in the build settings. So those are my thoughts there. Really don't like lowering min salary more than the projection, more than the default, especially in a sport like basketball or NFL for that matter. So I just don't think you're going to see duplication enough for it to be an issue. John also had a comment earlier, said you can also change your geometric mean sum based on the contest as well as an option to try. I think this is in relation to the conversation earlier with ownership. Just as like a review, we have these aggregate rules over here. You can make these rules based on projection, based on ownership. You could use some ownership. You could use geometric mean. These are things that we wanted to build into the app to give people more control over the ownership of their lineups that they're seeing. I think it's a great use. I specifically think it's a great use for MMA and for NFL Showdown specifically. So, there's nothing wrong with including those metrics into other contest types as well. I would be a little more careful with it, but nevertheless, I'm just, happy that we have the option to use it if you want to give it a shot and you understand those metrics. Okay. Question here from Reese Patterson. What are some ways to find upside for NBA players? I believe this is Reese's Pieces, which we already hit this question in the Discord. So, Reese, I got to your question a little bit ago. I hope you were here to catch it. If you're not, just remind it and I got to it. Got a question here from Demetrius. What is your process for NHL? That is a really good question. The answer is that I do not have a process for NHL. Looks like there was a second question here. Should I lower my NHL exposures for all players? And if so, what would you recommend? So, okay, I don't play that much NHL, but happy to talk about it because, I think that a lot of sports, I think that, game theory is very similar across the board. So what I would suggest doing is, if you're building for NHL, let's get some NHL lineups up here in the app. We'll talk about them. And I would recommend, not going straight to the exposures and instead going straight to the min uniques and then going to exposures. So, let's look at our lineups. You can see right off the bat, 20 lineups out of 500. We have 3 players at 50%. We have 1 at 45, a lot at 40. So I'm going to scroll down here to the bottom of my pool. I'm going to just start increasing my min uniques and see what this does to my exposures. So in our top 20, we're still maintaining at least 2 players different. I'm going to increase this to 3. Wow. Our lineups are really diverse right off the bat. Shout out to the sim diversity slider there. Oh no, wait, I'm not low enough. Okay. So we're getting 4 min uniques in our top 32 lineups. I think that's really good. It'll naturally decrease the exposure is what I'm saying. So, if you're not super opinionated about particular players, I would continue to mess around with the min unique slider and see how many min uniques you can get. I think in a NHL lineup, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 positions. So we already know that more than half of the players in every single lineup are different from one another. That gives you just such a more spread out pool of lineup portfolio. You're less likely to be all on one side or all on the other side of the standings. We're more likely going to be much more spread out and just gives you a better chance of just not going busto on any given night. So here, when we jump to 6, we start going lower into our pool. But, I'd even be happy with this. And look, all of our 50% exposures, the highest exposure we have now is 35%. So I'd say if you're not particularly opinionated about any specific player, I think the best way to lower your exposure naturally and the most positive EV way to do it is just start with your min uniques and continue to increase it until you don't go more than, a quarter to halfway into your pool. And, as long as you're not seeing lineups at like the very bottom of your pool, as we are starting to see at 7, getting really deep in here into the 400s, I would be much more comfortable staying at 6. So I think that's the best way to organically lower exposures and make adjustments to your lineup portfolio that keep your EV moving in a positive direction. So let me know if there's any questions there, Demetrius. All right, got a question here from John. Unless you expect a big discrepancy of a player ownership in one contest versus another, I would think the ownership fade slider will help take care of that problem. But I think I will start noting more when to make manual adjustments to ownership for smaller entry field contests. So the gist of the question here is that, John, to your point, you make a very good point that as you adjust the sliders for any given sport or contest, the ownership fade is going to move with that. So if you're playing 150 max and the largest field, we have an ownership fade of 6. If we have, so ownership is going to be valued more in these contests. If you're playing a single entry, 1 to 10,000 entrants, ownership is going to be valued half as much. So, the ownership fade slider moves, ownership gets weighted differently, but that still won't technically change the values of the ownership. So I still think there is value in changing ownership that you feel feels off or intuitively doesn't pass the eye test to you. So I think, noting them and making adjustments is definitely a high value add. All right. Next question from Graveyard Society, Secret Society. Is there a way to tell what percent a particular player will end up being in the optimal lineup? I can tell you that our best version of that solution is to do a research build where you're basically running a build with correlation off, ownership fade off, taking single slate simulations and running a build at those settings. So I'm just going to make a couple quick adjustments here so we can see the lineups. And what this is doing is it's taking a single simulation for every game and building lineups based on that. So what you could do is you run some builds, you look at the entire pool, and then you compare the exposures to the ownership. And, this is like our way of approximating quote unquote optimal rate. So out of all the players here, Sabonis looks like he's going to be more optimal than his projected ownership. So does Bam, Adebayo. And then, conversely, who do we have that looks pretty bad? You can also sort by leverage. If you sort by leverage, you can see the best top leverage plays, and then you can also see the worst. So, Klay Thompson looks pretty bad. He's not going to get there as much as his ownership would state. So this is our version of checking optimal rates. I think it's a good and useful method. So I would mess around with that. And, if that's what you're looking to do, work that into your process. Demetrius said, when I run my test build for NBA, I'm not getting any Luka. So, Demetrius, if you are set on getting Luka, what I would do in the post build screen is I would just increase his min exposure. So, if you're running 20 lineups and you're coming over here to your exposures and you're saying, hey, I'm not getting any Luka, where is he? So I'm going to type his name in here. I'm not getting any of him. Well, let's see how much we got. We got 11% of him in our pool of 500. So all you need to do is you need to come in here and increase his min exposure. And you'll start getting him. You can get as much of him as you want. You want 20%, you want 30%. As long as there are enough lineups to meet your min exposure, you can get to him. So I'd say that, if you're having trouble getting to as much of him as you want, what I would suggest doing is increasing my pool size to 1,500 and running a build again and trying it again. You're just going to get more lineups with him naturally by increasing the pool by 3x the size. Or what you can also do is you can come in here and you can increase his projection. That's another way to do it. I would, ask what are the reasons you want him? Have you just done some research that makes you want him? Maybe he's not the best play tonight. I don't know. But, I would try and grade the strength of the reasons you're trying to force him into your lineups. But, that being said, if you just want to take your stand on Luka, and you're not getting enough, go ahead and increase his projection. Should help you get to more of him in the post-build screen. All right. Continuing to roll through here. Got a question from Uncrabby Cabby. Said, hey, Andrew, how do I know that the changes that I am making to my exposures may be making my lineups suboptimal? Okay. I think that's a fair question. Uncrabby Cabby. What I would say is that, I would say that I think a good idea or a good way to kind of test this, we're going to go back to a normal build here, is how far in your pool do you have to go to get to a certain play that you want? And, we're going to change this to 1. And then we're going to open this up so we can see our lineups. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, just for the sake of the example, I'm going to take somebody who's in our pool, only a little bit. And a low pool player is, Kenrich Williams. And there's 12 lineups with him. So let's say, I want more lineups with him. So I'm going to say I want 30% of him. I'm going to double this. So how far in my pool did I have to go to find lineups with him? Only lineup 49 at 30%. I think that's okay. I think, as you start to increase this more, and we have to go further into the pool to find the lineups with him. So what I'm trying to do is essentially find lineups where he's like, the lineups that he is in are really low SaberScore lineups. I think that if you're forcing in min exposures and the builder has to go really far into the pool to find and match the exposures that you're asking for, I would be a little cautious with those adjustments. And I would think that the adjustments that you're making are starting to go down the wrong path, the suboptimal path, as you so called it. So, I would keep an eye on the adjustments that you're making, and especially in the exposures and where that leads you into your pool, and kind of use that as a factor of, hey, am I getting too far into the pool with the adjustments that I'm making? Maybe these aren't the best adjustments to make. So those are my thoughts there. Let me know if you have any follow-up, but I feel like that is a good thing to think about. So Michael asked, about running a 0-0-10 build. We just talked about, using a 0-0-10 build to find good plays, to check players against their ownership and see what their like optimal percent is in a given random sample of sims. So I think that's a great use. And, if you missed it, we just covered it. Just rewind a little bit and you'll be able to catch up on that. John said, it's like that. Do they know what you know that different levels, LOL, when reacting to ownership? It definitely is. And it's, the levels of thinking. I know it's something that Jordan Cooper likes to talk about, relating to the levels of thinking in poker. What do I have versus what does my opponent have versus what do I think my opponent thinks I have? It's ownership is the ultimate game theory in DFS, in my opinion. I think that, projections continue to get better every day, and ownership is really that thing that continues to be a mystery and continues to be very hard to solve for in different types of contests. So very, very fun, keeps the game intriguing. Yeah, John said it. They know what you know that they know. Exactly. So just the ultimate game theory aspect of DFS, in my opinion. DJ Sirius asked, can you create an NFL rule by position? For example, in tonight's showdown, pair QB as captain with at least 2 wide receivers, tight end, kicker from the same team, including both teams. Sorry if this was already asked. No worries. Happy to continue to cover it, even if it was. So we're going to hop over to NFL here, and we're going to hit the showdown slate. So question is asking, can I create a rule that says if I have a QB as my captain, pair with at least 2 wide receivers, tight end, or kicker from the same team? Okay, so the one thing about Showdown is that the sites don't treat players by their position technically. They either treat them as captain or flex. So if you want to do it, you unfortunately have to create a group manual rule and you have to add them in. So if I want to say, if at least one, and I'm going to say QB captain, so Lamar Jackson, then at least 2, and then you have to go to flex, and then you have to click in the players that you're looking for. So one thing you could do is you can use the filters still, to that way you don't have to look at the Bucks when you're making a rule for a Lamar Jackson quarterback rule. So then you could just come in here really quickly, add in his pass catchers, add in his kickers, and then I think you probably only want to do it if you want to add in Josh Oliver, you can. But we captured the kicker, we captured the pass catchers, and then boom, there's your rule for Lamar Jackson. And then you would just save that, and then you would go in and make the same exact rule for Tom Brady. And I would use the filters to make it a little easier on the eyes to go through and quickly click the players that you need to. So that's the way to make a rule for that. All right, getting pretty low in the queue here for questions. So if you guys have any last questions you guys want to ask before NBA kicks off, or before NBA tips off, before NFL kicks off, get those in now. We're going to keep rolling, and then when we get to the end, we'll see what is remaining. So gonna scroll through here. A lot of this was comments on things we were touching on. John said, assuming all players are efficiently priced, you would want to use all the salary in NBA. Yes. So the other thing with that is, the pricing is a model, is an algorithmic model from DraftKings, from FanDuel, and what's to say that their models are perfect? They're not. I mean, I don't think a lot of these models are perfect. And also, another thing with that is that the pricing is released like the night before. The pricing isn't taking into account injury news that pops up throughout the day, throughout the week for NFL. So if pricing changed from Monday to Friday, pricing would be a lot better for NFL. But because it doesn't, and because guys get rolled in and out, pricing becomes more inefficient throughout the week. And the same thing for NBA. As we get closer to tip-off, guys getting rolled in, guys getting rolled out, guys becoming starters that were once bench players, the pricing becomes more inefficient as we lead up to lock. So that's another thing to note there. Graveyard Secret Society said, thanks for all the info, Andrew. Happy to help. Any and all questions, send them in and we'll get to them. Pete said, any advice in regards to player pool size based on the size of the slate and number of entries? Okay, so as far as player pool, Pete, the way I like to handle it is, I kind of took this out of Max Steinberg's book. What Max likes to do is adjust the filter for your projection filter based on the size of the slate. So for Showdown, it's a lot different than like an NBA slate. So what I'll say is that, by default, this projection filter is set, I believe, to 13. I adjusted it to 7. So something I like to do is I like to adjust my projection filter based on the size of the slate. On large slates, when Max was on with Jordan, what Max said he likes to do is increase his to 18. That's how he does some player pool curation. I think on shorter slates like this, especially like the 2-gamers, I think there's a lot of merit for lowering your projection filter to get to some of those lower ownership plays that not a lot of people are getting to, especially if they use some type of threshold filter. So, on a large field slate, I think it's okay to raise the floor of every player because there are so many lineups that you can build on a 10-game slate. And then on a smaller slate, I think on like a 4-game slate, I would probably leave it at 13 myself. But on like a 2-game slate where now duplication kind of comes into play, I am more interested in lowering it. So I think like the slate context and the slate dynamics about number of games on a slate is more important to me with moving my filter up or down. So those are my thoughts there. DJ Sirius said, for NHL, correlation is huge. I can definitely agree with that. Also look at 1 and 2 lines along with which players correlate together on even strength lines and power play lines. Just my thoughts. Okay, this is going back to the question earlier about NHL. I know I didn't talk about too much NHL process because mostly I'm not a huge NHL player, but DJ Sirius is right. Line correlation is very, very important in NHL. So if you're going to use a stacking rule, which I think that, a baseline stacking rule in NHL is good, I would really strongly suggest turning on this must be on the same. And I would also I would add even strength or power play line. So, if you're going to be stacking, you mostly want to stack guys from the same line. I would give the builder the option to use either one of the two. I think that is a good thing to turn on by default. So just another tip there for NHL. I think that's a strong, baseline stack rule to use. Use 3 players from the same even strength or power play line. Can't really go wrong there. Graveyard said, thank you. You're welcome. Demetrius as well. Happy to, give my 2 cents on all your guys' questions. Ship Happens said, what's a good ownership percent you should have for NBA tonight? Is 225% ownership too high? Okay. And, just ask it again. So I'm going to get to all the questions. I won't skip any, I promise. If I do skip one, let me know, but I'm going to make sure I get to everything. So Ship Happens is asking about some ownership for NBA. And, to be quite honest with you, it's not something that I am factoring in too much. The only time I start to factor in ownership a lot is when the rate of duplication goes up. So, if lineups are more likely to be duplicated, that's bad because you're going to get less of the first place prize when you do indeed win. If you're chopping with 20 people, 50 people, 100 people, unless that's happening, I'm not as concerned about some ownership. And if I was concerned about ownership, I'm much more likely to use a geometric mean rule rather than a sum ownership rule. If you're not familiar with geomean, Jordan and I did a podcast a couple weeks ago when we released this feature. We did a very deep dive for about 30 minutes talking about geomean, how to use it. We brought up the actual formulas describing geomean. So if you go to our YouTube channel, you go to videos. If you scroll down here to this one right here that says product ownership and geometric mean, Jordan came on, did a great deep dive talking about it, broke it down really well. I would check that out. I think it's a much better metric than sum ownership. Product ownership or geometric mean for that matter are a lot better overall. Just like take your game, it's like the next step up from some ownership. I really like that metric when trying to avoid duplication. So check that out. And if you have any questions, let me know. This is our last question here from Graveyard Secret Society. Had a long stream today. Happy to get to everyone's questions. So this question says, when eliminating players from your pool with huge negative leverage scores, where would you draw the line? -10 or -7 or lower, building 150 lineups with a pool of 1,500 for GPPs? Okay, good question. So I'd say like the way I kind of go about it is, I'll run my research builds, I'll run my test builds, I'll kind of note guys that are negative leverage in the entire pool. And then the only thing that concerns me most of the time is when I have a negative leverage player in my pool of lineups, but they're showing up positive leverage in my 150. So, if I were to come in here, and I don't know why our exposures aren't loading. So I'm going to reset this, or, for that matter, I'm just going to open up this other build here, see if these load. Okay. So these are indeed loading. So like, let's say, Keegan Murray, we have a lot of positive leverage on him in our top 20. If I were to open this up to the whole pool, or actually, a better way to do it, now that I think about it, is that if you get rid of some of these columns just for opening this up, so I'm just going to get rid of position, status, value, just so I can see. If you go basically over here on the right, we have this pool exposure column. If Keegan Murray was like 25% owned, like half of his ownership, and which makes him a negative leverage in our pool, but we are getting positive leverage in our top 20, that like makes me a little like gun shy, like, hold on, what's going on here? I think a good example of that, a close example right off the bat, probably like Kevin Huerter or Harrison Barnes, where their pool exposure is negative, but their exposure in our top lineups is positive. There's not a right or wrong way to handle this. SaberSim is telling you that, given positional requirements and salary requirements, they still fit in well to the top lineups. I'm totally okay with managing your risk to these players. Whether you're like, hey, it's negative in my pool, it's positive in my top 20. I'm not like super comfortable with that. I'm going to just lower him to where I'm even with the field. And I think like that's totally an okay approach to take, kind of meet SaberSim halfway there and say, I'm not going to like lose to this guy, but I'm also not going to let this guy kill my lineups either. So he's not going to beat me. I'm just going to kind of match the field and, try and take shots elsewhere. I think that's like a totally okay approach. And then try and take shots on guys like, Sabonis, where his pull leverage is positive as well as your lineup leverage. So those are my thoughts there. Pete made a comment not sharing. Oh my gosh. Thank you, Pete. Okay. I didn't bring it up after I got rid of the YouTube. So all I was saying was that, we have guys like Sabonis where his pool. So what I did was I couldn't see the pool column before. So, when you're looking at your exposures, you have your exposures. Your exposures show the number of lineups that you're looking at, but you also have this pool. If you scroll over to the right, you can see your pool, but sometimes it's hidden by default. So what I'll do is I'll just get rid of some of these columns. So I just got rid of the position column, I'll usually leave the status, but just get rid of some of the columns. That way you can see the pool. That way they're all in one line, and you can kind of like test this across the board. So here, I have positive leverage on Bam in my pool. I also have positive leverage on him in my lineups. The spots that I was saying get weird is spots like Herder right here, where he's negative to his ownership in the pool, but positive or he was positive, but I lowered him. So that's all I'm saying. If you incorporate that pool in the columns, you can see, you could kind of give those eye tests. And I think that's a good way of managing your leverage, managing your risk in step 3. So thanks for calling that out. Wanted to walk back through that for everybody who was watching, who didn't get to see the screen. But that being said, everybody, had a nice long stream today. Got to everybody's questions. We will be right back tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. Glad everyone is enjoying the stream, getting their questions answered, and get your questions in the Office Hours channel in Discord for tomorrow. If you're not in the Discord, link in the description below. Good luck in all of your contests, NHL, NBA, NFL, and I will see you all tomorrow. Take care.